Hi, this is Mary from the Daily Sew. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make this simple drawstring backpack. It's very similar to the type that companies give away as promotion, except this one is upgraded with lining and a box bottom, and it's only going to take you 2 hours or less to make it. You're going to find this bag to be very practical and very adaptable should you want to add things like pockets to the exterior or even to the interior. I'm going to be donating my bag and others that I've made to Streetside. It's a local outreach group here in Asheville, North Carolina. They've been doing critical work in our town even before we were hit by Hurricane Helene just 2 weeks ago. If you would like to help with the Western North Carolina storm relief, I'm going to be leaving links to Streetside and other local outreach groups in the description. But if you're ready to make the bag, let's go. For this project, you'll need fabric. Ideally, the bag fabric needs to be mid to heavyweight fabric like twill, canvas, denim, and you're going to need a mid-weight fabric for the lining. You'll need about 1/2 to 2/3 of a yard for each, depending on the size of bag you want to make. You're also going to need scissors or rotary cutter, a ruler, fabric pencil, or another way to mark your fabric, and pins. Then you'll need something for the straps. You can use thick cord or flat webbing between 1/2 to 1 inch wide. You can also make the straps from fabric, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a little bit. If you're using cord or webbing, you'll need fray check to prevent the ends from unraveling. If your bag fabric is lightweight, I recommend applying a fusible interfacing to give the bag a little structure. A mid-weight interfacing like Pelon SF101 is a good overall choice. So I chose this cotton twill for the exterior, and it's thick enough that it doesn't need an interfacing. And I have a cotton gingham for the lining. I'm going to cut them out together since the exterior and the lining pieces are going to be the exact same. You can make the bag almost any size. I found cutting pieces 15 inches wide by 17 inches tall gives a nice bag size. I've also made these bags as small as 13 inches wide by 14 inches tall and as large as 18 inches wide by 20 inches tall. Basically, you want to think about the size of the person the bag is for and the purpose of the bag. Whatever size you make, the height is going to be larger than the width. And these measurements include a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So here's a bag I made earlier. And you can see this seam on the bottom corner. It's what gives the bag some shape and a flat bottom. In order to get that seam, we have to cut out the bottom corners. For this bag, which is 15 inches by 17 inches, I'm going to remove 2 inches from the corners. This is going to give me a 4-inch wide bottom. On the larger 18 by 20 inch bag, I removed 3 inches from the corners, and a smaller bag I might only remove 1 inch or 1.5 inches. Now, if your exterior fabric is lightweight, fusing the interfacing before cutting the bottom corners out is going to be easier than fusing it after you cut the corners. And you'll have to cut the lining bottom corners out as well. I have my lining stacked here with the bag pieces, so I'm going to cut it all out at the same time. Remember, we're cutting from the bottom, so if you have a print with a directional design, orient it so that you are cutting the bottom corners and not the top corners. Next, the casing and straps. The casing is the channel that the strap will move through to both close and open up the bag. How wide your casing needs to be depends on how wide your straps are. In other words, the width of the straps determines the width of your casing. So, we're going to mark our seam allowance down, that's a 1/2 inch. Then we're going to leave a little wiggle room between the seam, the top seam, and the casing, and mark where the top line of the stitches for the casing will be. So my cord is a 1/4 inch wide. I'm going to place my top line of stitches 7/8 inch down from the cut edge, which will be 3/8 inch down from the top of the sewn bag. Once the bag is sewn, it'll be 3/8 inches down. Then I'll plan the casing to be wide enough to accommodate my strap or cord and a little room to allow it to move. If I was using a flat type of strap, the same idea. Wide enough to fit your strap, plus at least 1/8 of an inch so to allow the strap to move within the casing. You're going to mark where the 2 lines of stitching will be, and then you're going to make a notch at those marks by clipping into the fabric about 1/4 inch, because your seam allowance is a 1/2 inch and you don't want to clip all the way into your seam allowance. just about halfway into your seam allowance. And you want to clip all 4 pieces, that's the bag and the lining pieces, on both sides, both the left and the right sides. Now for the straps. The straps will be 34 or 36 inches long for an adult, and a child's bag would be shorter, maybe 28 to 30 inches long. Thick cording like I'm using is fine, but a flat strap is a little more comfortable when the bag gets heavy. It doesn't cut into you as much. After cutting the cord or webbing, you want to apply fray check on the end so it doesn't unravel, set them aside to dry, and dab a little of the fray check on the rest of the cord or webbing so it doesn't unravel. You can also make your straps from fabric as I've done here. These are pretty comfortable because they're flat. To make straps, you want to cut 2 rectangles as long as you need. That's 34 or 36 inches long or shorter for a child's bag. And you want to do it 4 times the finished width. So if you want a 1-inch strap, you're going to make it 4 inches. You're going to cut it 4 inches wide. If your fabric is lightweight or shifty, using spray starch here will help make it easier. Fold the strap piece in half lengthwise and press well to get a good crease. Open it up and fold each raw edge in to meet that crease. Press these edges, fold it back in half so you now have a 4-layer thick strap, and you're going to stitch the layers together close to the edge along the long edges. And this is how it will look. It will be attached to the bag in the same way as the cord is as we get to that part of the tutorial. Lay your 2 lining pieces wrong side up. My fabric doesn't have a wrong side, so I have to be careful later not to be confused. The strap, no matter what type of strap, will be attached to the right-hand side on the wrong side of the lining between those notches that you made for the casing. 1 strap on 1 lining piece and the second strap on the second lining piece. It's important that the lining is wrong side up and you attach the straps to the same side. Now I've picked the right side, maybe you picked the left side, but the same side on the linings. Now go to the machine and sew the strap down inside the seam allowance. You're just tacking it down at a distance less than your seam allowance. So I've tacked my straps to the lining, keeping them in place. And before I get confused, I'm going to go ahead and label my fabric. I actually do this a lot. Put the 2 lining pieces right sides together. Notice that when they are together, the straps are now on opposite sides. See how we did that? You're going to pin the sides together and sew from the top down to the bottom. When you sew over the strap, go ahead and reverse. Sew back over and maybe do this a couple of times. You want to reinforce where the strap is attached because there's going to be a lot of strain on the strap at this point. Remember, 1/2-inch seam allowance. So I've sewn the lining side seam, and you can see where it goes over the strap. I've sewn back and forth a few times, reinforcing that stress point. Okay, let's sew the bag. Take the 2 exterior bag pieces and place them so the right sides are touching. Sew from the top to the first notch, stop. Then sew from the bottom notch to the bottom. It's going to look like this. From the top just to the top notch, stop. Then from the bottom notch down to the end. And that gives you, after you press the seam open, an opening in which the cord or the strap can exit out of the casing. Here it is on the finished bag. The hole here is where the cord exits from the casing and becomes the strap. So once more, you go from the top to the first notch, stop, clip your threads, start again at the bottom notch, and sew down all the way to the end with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Now with both the bag and the lining sewn, we're going to put them together. Place the bag inside the lining so that the right sides are together or touching. First, match up the side seams and pin those in place, and then pin around the top edge. Go to your machine and sew the lining to the bag all the way around the top edge, 1/2-inch seam allowance. So after sewing around the top edge, you have to press this seam allowance open. To do that, pull the bag away from the lining so it's one long tube. If you have a tailor's ham, you want to put that under the seam. If not, a folded towel could be very helpful. Give it a good press. This is going to make the next step so much easier. Now, flip the lining or the bag so that the two layers are together with wrong sides touching. Fold the lining and the bag directly on that seam line, nice and even. Ironing that seam open made this a whole lot easier. If you didn't iron, you skipped that step, you're going to find this a little more difficult. You don't want to see the lining peeping up over the bag or vice versa. So you can manipulate the fabric with your fingers to get that seam in place and then pin it. Press, then take it to the machine and sew around the top close to the edge to catch the seam allowance and to secure the evenness of that top edge. If the top notch you made for that casing is 3/8 inch or less, that's 1 centimeter or less, this stitching can also serve as the top of your casing if you want it to. If that top notch you made is a 1/2 inch or more below the seam line, sew twice around the top. First time close to the edge and the second time whatever distance your top notch is at. Okay, with that done, let's get the straps in place so we can sew the bottom of the casing. Pull the bag and lining apart again so you're looking at the wrong sides and orient it sideways like mine. You'll have one strap on the bottom and one strap on the top. The straps are going to cross over the bag. The strap on the top will come across the lining to the bottom, and the strap on the bottom will go underneath to the top. Then, after crossing over, the strap will exit out through the opening you made in the bag side seam. You're going to do the same for the second strap. You carry it across to the opposite side it was sewn to, then you exit out through the space left in the side seam of the bag. After the straps are threaded correctly, we're going to put the two layers back together and sew the casing without catching the strap. In order that we don't catch the straps, first we're going to gently pull on them to remove any slack. Then, with fingers, feel for the cord or strap and push it up against those casing stitches that you sewed. Pin it in place. You're going to pin through the bag and the strap or the cord. This makes sewing the bottom line of casing so much easier and faster. Just getting that strap out of the way. Then align both the bottom edge of the bag and the bottom edge of the lining and pin those together. This is going to keep the lining from creeping up when you're sewing that casing. The bottom line of stitching for the casing will be just below the opening on that side seam. So measure down if you need to and decide how far you're going to sew that bottom line. If you have a flat strap, you do not want to sew right up against it. Give the strap some room to move within the casing. If your sewing machine does not have an etched-in guideline for the amount you need, as most machines stop at 1 inch wide, you could place a piece of painter's tape on your sewing machine bed there to act as the guide. Okay, sew that bottom line of casing and don't catch the straps in the stitches. So remove the pins and check that the straps move. All right, great, I'm good. Now we sew the bottom. You're going to flip the bag so the right sides are touching and sew across the bottom edge of the bag. Be sure that the straps are out of the way. The bottom seam sewn next the corners. The straps will attach to the bag at the corners. So you find the strap and bring it straight down the side that it exited out on and poke it out of the corner. If you have a flat strap and not a cord, it's important to check that it's not twisted. Line up the bottom seam to the side seam. The strap is centered between those seams and it can stick out a little bit there, or you can line it up. The cord can be bulky, so you might have to repin it to get out any wonky funkiness there. If you pull on the inner corners of that cutout square, it's going to flatten out nicely and the seams will line up. Then you just have to put the strap in the center. So after pinning, sew across this opening with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and when you sew over the strap, just like we did when we sewed the strap to the lining, go back and forth a couple of times to reinforce this attachment. Strap's in, and you can see how I reinforce where the strap is attached onto the lining. You want the lining to be wrong side out or right sides together, and again, my fabric being the same on both sides, I messed up here. Okay, right sides together. Unlike the bottom seam on the bag, you cannot close the lining bottom up completely. If you did, you're not going to be able to pull the bag through when you're done. we have to leave an opening about 4 inches wide. If you have very stiff fabric, make the opening at least 5 inches wide. Or if you have a very large bag, make the opening at least 5 inches large. Start at the corner and sew down to a couple inches before the midpoint. The opening doesn't have to be a precise amount, but large enough to pull the bag through. I like to put double pins, 2 pins close to each other, anywhere I have to stop sewing. If I see 1 pin, that's normal, and I just keep sewing. But if I see 2 pins, that's unusual, and so I know, oh yeah, I need to stop. So from one corner to the double pins, and then the opposite corner to the double pins on that side. We'll sew these corners exactly how we sewed the bag's corners, except no straps or cords. Just pull the inside corners of that square apart and line up the bottom and side seams. Pin together and sew across with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. After the lining corners are sewn, find the bottom opening, reach in, and pull out the bag. Great, now we'll close up the hole. You can see the seam allowance tends to fold back on its own, which is nice. Line up the folds and stitch close by machine, which will be visible, or you could close it by hand, which is more subtle and, if not, invisible. I chose to sew by machine, and matching thread would have been better, but Place the lining inside your bag, and voila, your bag is done. You got a nice flat bottom here. It gives it a roomy feel, lots of room to put things in. If you want, you could have added patches or design to the exterior before you sewed it all together. You could add a pocket, you could add an inside pocket. It's a very adaptable bag. I have instructions on my blog for a fancier version of this bag, and I will put that link in the description. Well, I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.